On today's episode of the NASM CPT Podcast with me, Rick Richey, I speak with longtime friend of the podcast, Dr. Brad Dieter, to discuss the updated dietary guidelines for Americans. All right, so differences, what we discussed, differences in the previous models of the food and dietary guidelines. And we talk about the old pyramid a little bit, MyPlate, and now the new upside down pyramid. Listen, we talk about shifts in protein. What does it mean when it comes to saturated fat in the new model and ultra processed foods? And most importantly, what does that mean for personal trainers and coaches and their clients? So make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family, and leave a 5-star review. Now, here's the episode on the updated guidelines for Americans.
You're listening to the NASM CPT Podcast with Rick Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM CPT Podcast. My name is Rick Richey, and today we're going to be discussing the HSS updated dietary guidelines for Americans. It started in 2025, and so there's a projection that this will be 2025 through 2030. This is what the recommendations will be. But let's review that. And rather than having me review it, because it's not my thing, I have the absolute privilege of having a longtime friend of the podcast joining us as a guest today. And this person is an exercise physiologist, molecular biologist, a biostatistician with a BA from Washington State University, a master's in biomechanics from University of Idaho, PhD, again, University of Idaho, postdoctoral work in metabolism and inflammation, and find new research in therapeutics for diabetic complications, which I greatly appreciate. So welcome, longtime friend of the podcast, Dr. Brad Dieter. Hi, Brad.
Rick, it's great to be back. It's nice to see you in this new year we're in.
Man, thank you. I appreciate it. It's always good to see you, and I'm so very grateful to have you on. Right now, in light of the new dietary guidelines and with new information and new data, and I don't know, maybe just trying to get an understanding from somebody with your depth of knowledge and research within nutrition, have a discussion. But prior to when we get to that, I kind of went through a little rambling, and I know if you're anything like me, you're like, cringe, stop talking about me. But I'm going to let you talk about yourself a little bit in what it is that you currently do, and then let's get into the HSS guidelines.
Yeah, so currently I wear a few hats. One, I run a direct-to-consumer nutrition and online coaching company. So we work directly with individuals on nutrition coaching and online personal training. We also do a whole bunch of education. We've got an online education platform. We work with universities and corporations to do kind of health and wellness education. I also sit on the NISM Scientific Advisory Board along with a bunch of other great people. We're actually headed down there in a couple months to meet for the year, which will be exciting, mostly because the people are awesome, but it's always nice to get out of here in the Northwest and go down to some sun around that time of year.
That's very true.
Yeah, and then kind of do some consulting in the health, wellness, biotechnology space, and focused on how can we try to get people to live better.
Oh, man, I love it and I appreciate it. But now I want to really dive into what some of your expertise are and kind of discuss what, like there was an old pyramid, and then it went from a pyramid to a plate, and then it went to the pyramid, but they just flipped it upside down apparently. So first of all, it just helped me and everybody else listening understand, I don't know, maybe the turns that we've taken, and then what it is that we see right now.
Yeah, I mean, over the last basically century, we've really tried to figure out how can we provide guidelines for people at scale so that people can have a better idea of what they should be eating on a daily basis. And one of the tools that we've used over the last few, last century or so, especially the last few decades, are visual representations. And so, the food pyramid that we mostly grew up with, we knew for a long time. What was really interesting is people had a really hard time like actually following those guidelines. So they went to a plate to see if that would help people. Again, that really didn't have a meaningful impact on people's behavior. And now with the updated guidelines, I think really what they tried to do is the new guidelines are quite a bit different from the old ones. And we can talk about some of the specifics. And so I think what they were trying to do with the image is really just kind of change how people think from a visual perspective about their food. But then when you get into the actual like details of the guidelines, what has changed is not quite as much as people think. And it's kind of opened up some additional discussions. And so I think it's actually a good opportunity to discuss, hey, what do we know about the guidelines? What impact do they actually have on behavior? And then these new ones that are rolling out in this upside down triangle, like what do we see from the visual perspective versus what do the new guidelines actually suggest? And I think just trying to have a conversation there is a good place to start.
All right, cool. So let's get into some of these changes, which I want to probably spend less than half of our time on what it is the changes actually are. But I do want to discuss them and understand them. But I think the follow-up to that is now a little more than half of our conversation, get a better understanding of what that means for me as a personal trainer or for coaches and for clients. What does that mean? What does that mean for my implementation and an understanding of the information? So I think if you've got a place to start, let's start. Otherwise, I'm going to throw some things out to you because I've got some ideas.
Yeah, I think maybe the first place to start is just level set.
Okay.
What effect do the guidelines actually have on behavior? I think is probably the best place to start, because I think what we saw on the internet when these were released was everybody was very concerned that this was going to meaningfully change people's behavior in the wrong direction. And the reality is, for the last, half century, the food guidelines haven't really driven behavior. I mean, for example, if we look at the most recent guidelines, the last two sets, kind of the pre-2020 and then the 2020 to 2025, like 80 to 90% of U.S. adults didn't meet the fruit guidelines. 90 to 99% of U.S. adults didn't meet the vegetable guidelines. Only 66% of U.S. adults, or actually, only 33% of U.S. adults met the saturated fat guidelines. And then about 90% of U.S. adults actually exceeded the recommendation for empty or discretionary calories as they were in the old food pyramid and the MyPlate. So just to start there is, whatever the guidelines say, they actually have very little impact on people's actual behavior. And so it comes down to individual attention with people and giving them more specifics, and then trying to guide their behavior change to reach those targets.
So even though there's little impact, I guess, on what those dietary guidelines suggest, are there any things that maybe pop out that could elevate concerns if you have people like me, like personal trainers who are like, well, I can't really speak beyond the scope of what the guidelines are. So now I'm speaking into the suggested guidelines, and this is me working with somebody trying to help them with their diets. Where can I go with this? So it may not be great for general population, but at least personal trainers, fitness professionals are out there trying to go, okay, well, here's something that I can use as my base. Do we lean in to fruit, vegetable, and protein intake as we see it now and avoid other parts, or kind of not focus as much on other parts? So where do we turn for this?
Yeah, I think, as a personal trainer and maybe even as a nutrition coach, like a certified nutrition coach, if you're watching this, I think what these guidelines do from our scope of practice is they really allow us to focus on some of the things that we've learned over the last, 20, 30 years or so about what actually moves the needle in terms of people's nutrition. Emphasizing fruit and vegetable intake, we know that individuals who have a higher intake of fruits and vegetables generally tend to have better health outcomes. They eat lower calorie diets, they eat higher quality diets in general, and their likelihood of carrying a high BMI later in life is much lower. So, prioritizing fruit and vegetable intake is a great recommendation. When we talk about the update to the protein guidelines, I think there is a lot of benefit to the changes that were made for a couple of reasons. One, the old guidelines focused really on kind of the minimum protein requirement for what's basically required to prevent chronic disease, sarcopenia, protein deficiencies, things like that. And the new guidelines actually give us a little bit more of a range of here's what we're starting to learn about optimal protein intake in terms of, grams per body weight to kind of help maintain lean body mass later in life. And so having those two things now available in the conversation within scope of practice to lean on the guidelines, I think is really beneficial for us as practitioners.
Nice. And I agree with that. There's kind of a floor, right? So the 0.8 grams per kilograms of body weight protein to body weight. I think that was a good base. But then when you look at a lot of the content and the research that's out there, we see that oftentimes when somebody wants to build muscle, you got to increase protein. But then a lot of times too, we see that when somebody wants to focus on their weight loss journey, we also see an increase in the recommendations for protein, which is helpful with, satiation and other things where it kind of drives down, I'm assuming, the overall calorie count. So would you say that that's one of the things? Because right now, let's just be honest, the society, we are very focused on protein right now. And, as a fitness professional, I'm kind of here for it. So what are your thoughts on that? And we're looking better with the protein stance than maybe we were previously?
Yeah, I think it gives people, in terms of like scope of practice of what we do, the guidelines to have those conversations around, hey, here's what we see generally leads to better health outcomes for people, both in terms of weight loss and then in terms of just maintaining lean body mass as you age. And so I think those are two things that we now have in our arsenal that we can lean on the guidelines. And so having that in there, I think, is a meaningful change. Now, the only caveat there is you got to make sure that you focus on the food quality with that as well, right? What recommendations are being made to hit those protein targets? And so I think it's always, hey, what are the, are you eating a bunch of fried chicken, or are you eating salmon, lean cuts of steak, chicken, dairy, things like that? Those are then important pieces to fold into that conversation.
Right. And I think it's also worthwhile stating that even though that higher end of 1.6 grams per kilogram when it comes to protein intake is high, it's high based on the previous model, right? But when it comes to like sports nutrition, that's actually a relatively moderate amount of intake, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And then just remember that these guidelines are for the general population, right? We have additional information. Yeah. Athlete subpopulations are very different, right? We even know protein requirements are different amongst endurance athletes versus, strength athletes versus, power athletes versus bodybuilders. Like, there's different recommendations based on what you're demanding from your body. So just remember that these are guidelines for general population.
Yeah. I also think it's, when you point this out and you look at total calorie intake, let's just use an example that I've got pulled up here. If I've got a person who weighs 85 kilograms, that's 136 kilograms of protein when it comes to intake, but that's only 544 calories. So if you're looking at a 2,500 calorie a day diet, it's only 22% of total calorie intake. So it's not actually a massive amount of protein in the scope of protein intake. or calorie intake.
Yep. And one of the things I always remind people is if you actually do the math, the protein guidelines have a really wide window, right? If we translate this into, even like grams per pound, like you'll notice, or we can even keep it grams per kilo, like 0.4 grams per kilogram. That's a, 30 to 40, grams per day of protein difference for somebody at the same body weight, right? So that is a meaningful window of, you can eat on the lower end or the higher end and you're still in those guidelines.
Right. Let's, I think it's good primarily because we do see a lot of change even at the grocery stores. And I know that you've seen it. I know the people listening to this, personal trainers, know what I'm talking about. I've been getting this like high protein cereal. Like there's all sort, like everything's got extra protein in it. It's so hot right now. That Hansel, so hot right now. This protein.
That's a great reference. Great Zoolander reference.
I really appreciate you. This is why I appreciate you so much, Brad. So the protein is big. It's hot right now. And like I said, I'm here for it. But I do remember I don't remember if it was RFK, but somebody just said the war on protein is over. I was like, there ain't no war on protein. Yeah. Like protein's hot. Like that's been out and about. It's just now the guidelines are catching up to a general consensus of what protein looks like. Now, we've got personal trainers here, so there's a particular love and appreciation for protein. But I don't want to exhaust our entire time when it comes to this. But I do want to point out that there is, and you've mentioned it, you kind of like alluded to this, right? Where there is kind of there's the fat component.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this just a little bit, and from your perspective, and also trying to balance out this protein intake with the saturated fat intake. And then if we're bringing in a lot of protein, that we do have to still, even with elevated saturated fat considerations in this, that we still have to be careful about it.
Yeah. And so I think this is probably one of the areas where the media missed the mark. And I think us as consumers, when we first saw this, I think probably didn't do enough due diligence. Like when you look at the new upside down triangle, people just assume that it had higher intakes of saturated fat. But the actual guidelines, if you go into the guidelines and look at them, they still recommend less than 10% of total daily calorie intake come from saturated fat. So the saturated fat guidelines themselves have not actually changed to any meaningful degree with this update. I think what happened is people saw more full fat dairy and an emphasis on protein and just assumed that it was going to be, higher saturated fat requirements or guidelines, but they actually have stayed the same of recommending less than 10% of total daily calorie intake.
Gotcha. I think my concern here is that if we are looking at increasing the amount of whole milk and animal proteins, which are also suggested, then that does oftentimes create a bit of concern, even if sat fat hasn't changed. With the new protein guidelines, are we looking at increased saturated fat anyway? And that's without the whole butter and the tallow and all the other kind of supplementary fat that can go into your foods, which is a kind of a suggestion in there. That we do need to still be aware of saturated fat intake, especially with the increased protein intake.
100%. And this is where, kind of going back to the discussion earlier of like the food quality definitely matters, right? We can get a meaningful amount of protein in our diet, even at the higher intakes, from very low saturated fat sources, right? We can have plant-based protein sources in our diet that are relatively high in protein, especially when they're combined with other kind of lower fat, leaner protein sources. And so it's totally reasonable to hit those protein targets while, maintaining that saturated fat is less than 10% of total daily calorie intake.
Yeah, that's
you just can't live on.
I want to focus on.
Yeah, you just can't have ribeye steaks for every meal. That's kind of the lesson
bread
there.
ruins everything. I can't afford that anyway. So, but I think that that's really what's important for a takeaway is not that it says this in the new guidelines, but what does that mean for us as fitness professionals and consumers and eaters? What does that mean in practicality? And I think that's really where I want to, create some understanding that it's kind of challenging a lot of times to just say, okay, here's your protein source, but and it's mostly from animal, but you do have to still be aware of these other components, even though you're given a window and you say, okay, you've got this amount of fat you can take in. And I believe, and Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they say less than 10% of calories from that. And to be clear, we also need to point out calories and not grams.
Yeah.
So I do think that sometimes we don't understand that if a lot of times we count, what are the grams that I'm having in, but those really have to parse out and be like, okay, is it 10% of caloric intake? And that's where we're concerning ourselves with on this. Yeah.
So that would be, let's say, just to keep numbers easy, a 2,500 calorie a day diet would be, less than 250 calories from saturated fat, which is, I think, less than like 27 grams a day, which is a totally reasonable target if, your diet looks like you have, a couple eggs with some additional egg whites for breakfast. You have, some chicken at lunch and some fish at dinner with some plant-based protein sources in there. It's totally reasonable to keep those within that as long as you're not eating primarily, if your protein sources are not entirely like full fat dairy, full fat red meat. You can fall within those guidelines from a relatively normal diet.
Okay, so you mentioned something there, and let me just grab a hold of it like a dog with a bone. Protein, like plant-based protein, and there's really an assumption from a lot of people that that plant-based protein is not included in this. And I think because there's a removal of some things that are in there, which we'll talk about too. But can we just talk about this for a second? Like, what are plant-based proteins, and are we, is that part of what we're looking at, and where in this pyramid that I'm still having, some issues wrapping my head around the shape of it, because it's not how my brain thinks when it comes to pyramid. Now, you said a martini glass. I'm just kidding. That is not how my mind thinks.
Look at it upside down, right?
I do. Yeah, exactly. I go in like Batman to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think kind of where you're getting at there is when you look at like the old food pyramid versus this new one, is they basically took the old bottom, which used to be the largest source, which was whole grains, right? Which is kind of our plant-based intake. And now that becomes one of the smaller pieces of the guidelines, right? And so just like, how do we think through that? And what does that actually mean for people? So I think the reality of it is, if we go look at the old food pyramid, I'd have to go back and look because it's been so long, but I think they recommended like 6 to 11 servings of whole grains a day. I think that's right. Maybe I'm a little high on that, but it's been so long since I've looked at it.
Have it pulled up, I'll tell you.
But that was a pretty high intake.
You are correct, by the way. 6 to 11.
Oh, hey, that's good. My brain's still intact. I haven't lost it to age yet. If you look at like the objective amount of total calories and total grams of carbohydrates in your diet, that was a pretty high amount for the average American at the average intake level. And so I think when we look at like the current recommendations of like at a 2,500 calorie a day diet, let's just say that's average, it's about like 3 to 5 servings of whole grains a day, which is probably a little bit more in line with the average person. And I think that allows you to get between that and the fruit and vegetable requirements, you're going to reach your dietary fiber requirements, right? Which is 14 grams per 1,000 calories. If you choose things like, quinoa, lentils, whole grains, you're probably going to get, 20 to 40 grams a day of protein just from reaching those targets, from, 3 to 5 servings of whole grains a day. Like that's that's 10 to 20% of your daily protein intake. So if you're smart about the food choices, you're still going to hit most of your nutrient requirements within that window.
Yeah, but I think if we look back at the MyPlate, so if we go from the pyramid, the previous pyramid, like the 1992 pyramid, where it's 6 to 11 servings, and then you look at the MyPlate, where it's a quarter of the plate.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing that it's almost like a secondary or tertiary food. What are your thoughts on that? And then also I want to make sure that I'm very clear with this point. Like, grains can be much more affordable for a lot of people. And if we're looking at people just, we're trying to get by, and I can't just go out and buy meats to have that many calories necessarily, but it is easier for me to buy some rice and beans, by the way, also delicious. So where does that fit in a diet? And also being very aware, and I get it, like for personal training clients, if they're paying money for a personal trainer, they're probably not relying financially on that. But I want to understand this from the standard kind of like general perspective here, where foods can be unaffordable a lot of times.
Yeah. So I think probably the best way to understand this is to go back to kind of one of the comments from earlier, is the visual image that they put out of this upside down pyramid, I think was probably the wrong choice, because if you actually go and look at how much of your total daily food in terms of like by weight or by serving size, whole grains are still probably one of the larger components, right? Like if you look at, if you go into the guidelines, and just to go back to that like 2,500 calorie a day example, it's about 12 ounces of protein a day they're suggesting, right? It's about, healthy fats. It's about 5 teaspoons a day of like olive oil, avocado, butter, nuts, seeds, things like that. And then the whole grains, it's about 3 cups a day of whole grains.
Okay.
Right. So it's like, that's still a meaningful amount of food in a given day, right? It's
true, but I feel like you're right when I see that upside down pyramid, and butter is like halfway up the pyramid, and the grains are really low down at the bottom. I'm like, should I be eating more butter?
Yeah, I'd have to go do the math on this, but I think like a teaspoon of butter is probably like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 40 to 80 calories. I'd have to go double check. You might be able to do the math. But if they recommend, 5 of those a day at a 2,500 calorie a day diet, that's what, 300 to 500 calories a day from healthy fats. Is that right?
So a teaspoon of butter is 34 calories.
Okay. Yeah. So 150 to 200 calories a day from healthy fats, like that's much lower. And then if you look at 3 cups of whole grains, we're probably, depending on what you choose, that's in the several hundred, 4, 5, 600 calories a day. So it's like the visual kind of missed what the actual guidelines suggest in terms of what portion of your total daily calories are from that, right? So they're still recommending about, 20 to 30% of your calories come from whole grains, and then probably another, 10 to 20% come from fruits and vegetables. So we're still in that 30 to 40% of total calories come from like quote unquote healthy carbohydrates.
Okay. All right. So I've got more things I want to talk about, but before I talk about those things, give me just a moment to say this. This episode of the NASM CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM One, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients, which I just send some information to my clients just on Monday. For the Edge app, you can enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access to free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to NASM.org/membership to learn more about NASM one. Okay, so Brad, let's talk ultra processed foods. So I think there's a lot to be said for what changes were made and ultra processed foods. So do me a flavor and talk about what that is. What are ultra processed foods, and what are the changes in regard to what we're talking about with these?
So the way that I usually like to describe this is you can think of your food on a spectrum from completely unprocessed, like you grow an apple in your backyard on an apple tree and you just pull it off the tree and eat it. That's like as unprocessed as possible. And then you have foods that are on the other end of the spectrum, which is like Doritos, right? It's nothing about that is in its original form. It's from flour that's been, ground and processed. It's from, oils that have been extracted. It's from flavors that have been generated in a lab. And the food itself is just like engineered to maximize intake. And it's in packaging and it's on the store and it will sit on the shelf for years. So it's like foods fall somewhere in that spectrum, right? If you cook an egg, it's considered some form of processing, right? So food is anywhere on that spectrum. But most people think about processed foods as the ones that are kind of more towards the Dorito end. And so these guidelines really try to emphasize people fall further away from that end of the spectrum. And I think in general, that's pretty good advice for most people. What we know about processed foods is they primarily cause us to consume more calories than we would otherwise. Like that's one of the major impacts that processed foods have on our health. There's been a bunch of studies that have looked at if you take people and give them a highly processed diet versus an unprocessed diet, regardless of what effects the individual ingredients have on our health in totality, they usually cause us to eat about 500 calories more a day. So if you compound that over years or decades of your life, like, yes, you're probably going to end up with a higher BMI, a higher risk of all these chronic diseases, in large part because they cause us to consume more calories than we would otherwise. And so that's a big reason why people should consider consuming far fewer processed foods.
Oh, facts. I mean, you can't open a bag of chips of any sort in my house and expect to get some later because it's gone. Those are gone. They will be eaten. Yep. If it's not me, it is my children. My wife somehow has this magical ability to not be sucked in by the ultra processed foods, but she also is a little weird where like one time we were eating tacos and there were these shells, like the wrap, and it wasn't that good. And then she even agreed it wasn't that good. And then she read the ingredients and she decided that it did taste good and that she would eat more. And I was like, I wish I could just decide that healthier food tasted better.
She gaslit herself into eating healthier.
Yes, she did. I want to gaslight myself into eating much, much healthier, and ends up that I throughout the years have been much better because early on I was really focused on, well, I can almost eat anything I want. It just doesn't, as long as my calorie intake, and that was because there was a big push back in my early days where it's like, it doesn't matter what you eat, just as long as you're eating this and that, like your calories. And I realized that it does matter what you eat because I can't control the amount of calories I oftentimes have when I open, my bugaboo is wheat thins. I just can't, the box is small and I will not share them with anybody. They will be gone. And I will only open it when nobody's home. I was like, okay, quietly, let me just eat this whole thing. So I have to be careful. And you know what I found too, and this is maybe an application which is important. If it's not in my house, I don't have to have it. But it's the once you start, it is really hard to stop. And I think that's part of the, forgive me for saying this, addictive nature of these ultra processed foods, is that it's it's easily consumable. It is not satiating whatsoever. And by the time I get full on eating a bag of chips, I have eaten way too many calories.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fairly easy to eat 800 to 1,000 calories of Doritos. It's really hard to eat 800 to 1,000 calories of like carrots and hummus as a snack. Like that's, you know?
Yeah. In fact, it's funny you said that, because that was my go-to example without the hummus. I would just say, if you're hungry, ask yourself, are you hungry enough to eat a carrot? And then if you are, eat a carrot. Right? Like, don't be like, yes, I'm hungry enough to eat a carrot, Doritos, right? Like, are you hungry enough to eat a carrot? And then maybe reach for that carrot because you are hungry enough to eat it. So a lot of times our brains will tell us that we're hungry. And listen, I don't know this world as much as you, but I would say that hunger oftentimes is not hunger, but a craving. And that's why I will go and open my refrigerator door half a dozen times and not eat anything. It's not because I'm hungry. It's because I want something to do. I want something to I want my bump. I want my little hit of food.
Yep.
But not a carrot hit.
Yeah, I think that's also, I mean, this is not related to the guidelines, but the point you just made is, this new generation of weight loss medications have really kind of highlighted that fact about human behavior, hunger, enjoyment being a large part of why we eat in the modern world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel that's where, I think this is where the new guidelines got their initial foothold, is being more concerned about the processed food really than anything else.
Yeah.
And then kind of what other changes can we make while we're also being concerned about the amount of ultra processed foods. I don't know if that's true, but that's my assumption. I don't know if you have any insights to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it would have been interesting to be in the room as these are being drafted. But if you go through and you look at, the people who were involved in the guidelines, like if you go to the realfood.gov, you can actually download the thing that's like the scientific foundations for the dietary guidelines. And you can look at who was involved and where they're from. And it paints a pretty clear picture of kind of how we arrived at these guidelines. I mean, there was obviously, the current administration and their leanings about food ingredients, ultra processed foods. Some of the language that has been used in the media definitely shows up in these guidelines. And then you look at the subject matter experts, like a lot of them are from different industry, right? Dairy, ag, all of those things. So you can start to see where these came from for sure.
And do you think really the focus we're looking at here is also looking, rather than necessarily macros as a focus, we are looking at whole foods, less, even if your macros are coming from an ultra processed source, that they are still leaning into see if you can get the macros that you even want from a whole food source. Because I feel like that's kind of a goal that they were driving to. What is your whole food intake?
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at the actual guidelines, this is really what they're focused on. They look at serving size and food group, right? And the quality of that food. And so I think generally speaking, if people can take those three concepts and say, hey, here's what my rough calorie requirements are for me as an individual. 2, here's how that translates into like serving sizes by food group, right? Okay, here's how much protein I need at each meal. Here's how many vegetables and fruits, like the serving size I need, and then translate that into the food choices that are recommended. I mean, I think if people actually did follow those, it would be an improvement. Now, as we open the show with how many people actually follow the guidelines, that's a different story.
Okay. Well, with this insight, because I'm going to tell you, your insights really, when you say the words out loud versus see what that pyramid looks like, it actually doesn't seem too wild. And I think I got the immediate shock of what the heck are they doing over there? So
Yeah.
like, give me your, as we come to an end of our conversation together, let's just kind of wrap this up and give me your kind of feedback overall about what we're seeing when it comes to like previous to current recommendations.
Yeah, I think if we just look at, the changing landscape of the overall health of the American population, what we see in just the built environments and the lives that we live today, if you actually go through and look at the specifics of the guidelines, ignore the upside down triangle and look at it, there's a lot of good things in there that we can pull from it, right? My philosophy is always take the good and discard the not useful. If people have protein intake from kind of relatively lean whole food protein sources that include some animals and some plants, and they hit that 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, if they hit the, combined, it's about, 5 servings ish total of fruits and vegetables per day. The rest of their carbohydrates are rounded out with, relatively unprocessed whole grains, and they get some, decent healthy fats in their diet, which is really what the guidelines suggest. If everybody followed that, we would see an improvement in the overall health of our population. But how do these end up translating down to people, and does it actually move behavior? I think is going to, to be determined. The one concern I do have is there is some messaging from the administration that these are going to be required in like schools and other government places. Is then how do these actually translate, right? What do these meals actually look like? Are they going to be followed? And then how do we actually get food prices to a reasonable level in this country? I think those are the big things that are going to actually move the needle.
Well, I would also hope too, and this may be just stories that I've heard, but at some point they were saying, well, in order for us to keep prices low, we need to agree that certain things are vegetables. And you can argue, and I think they did, that a French fry is a vegetable. But I also remember reading at some point that they agreed that ketchup was a vegetable. And so maybe with these new guidelines within the schools, because we're minimizing these ultra processed foods, then can we hopefully now say, no, ketchup is not a vegetable? And I would like to see that the same when it comes to French fries.
Yeah. I mean, I think you bring up a really good point. And this was one of the discussions that I saw online over the last few weeks. There's a lot of concern about, hey, these are the guidelines that are now going to be rolled out to schools and things like that. And a large part of the U.S. population, the children, get a lot of their meals from schools. Yeah. I mean, Rick, I don't know if you remember what school lunches looked like when we were kids, but it was like the square cardboard pizza with a juice box, and like it was all processed foods, right? I don't remember that. I mean, if I were to go back, I don't think it could get worse. From what I remember as a kid. So, I mean, if we start to see more fruits, more vegetables being served in our schools, I mean, that would probably be a good thing, or at least an improvement.
Yeah, I agree. But I will also say this, go back to my wife at the elementary school. My kids were in elementary school. She was on the wellness committee, and she made a big push to try to get a salad bar into it. And I think the principal, just practically speaking, said we're just going to be throwing away a lot of salad.
Yeah, that is true.
There's a difference between getting kids to eat an apple and getting them to eat applesauce or some of those baked apples with additional sugar and cinnamon. So it's hard. Like, you want, especially people who have food insecurity, to be able to even honestly get calories into their body. But are they going to leave some of the food by the wayside because they're like, I just like broccoli is not my thing, or Brussels sprouts, or a full actual apple? And, that I can see where that would be a concern as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. It's an issue across the board that I think is going to take time to figure out. I mean, there's, the discussions of what's provided by the governments at schools, what's provided for the households, what are the decisions made in those households. Like, it's a really complicated topic.
It is complicated, and maybe at some point I'll be able to get you back in here and delve in a little bit deeper about some additional complications. But for now, I want to say thank you so much, Brad, for being on the show and sharing your expertise with me and the audience here. Can you do a favor? Just provide, again, a little bit, contact information if people want to. I know that you guys have maybe an app or something like that. So if you want to plug it, like, go ahead and take that, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, I would say the best place to find me is just at macrosinc.net. My email address, you can always reach out to me. It's just brad.dieter@macrosinc.net. We have a free nutrition tracking app called MacroSync, which is kind of just a play on words of the company name. We've got a bunch of free education resources, content on our website, and would love you guys to check it out.
Oh, that's perfect. All right. Hey, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate you being on the show today. I want to say to everyone, thank you for listening, especially if you made it to the end. And thanks to our producer, Eric Sorensen. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, share, leave a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out, hit me up. You can do so on Instagram at dr.rickritchie, or you can email me, rick.ritchie@nasm.org. Y'all keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.